Hey everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Before we dive into tonight's journey, take a quick moment. If you're enjoying the content, hit that like button and consider subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you know, and it ensures you won't miss the stories we explore here. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always find it fascinating to see just how far across the globe this reaches, different countries, different time zones, all of us here together for the same story. Now, here's what I want you to do. Dim the lights. Get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan if you have one. That soft background hum creates the perfect atmosphere. No distractions. Just you, me, and the story. Tonight, we're stepping back in time to explore something that has fascinated historians for centuries. A tale of power, mystery, and a face that refused to be forgotten. So settle in. Take a breath. And let's begin. The sun crested the Aegean like a molten coin spilling gold across a landscape that had known the footsteps of gods and the ambitions of men for millennia. But on this particular morning in 450 BCE, somewhere in the sprawl of Athens or the disciplined rows of Sparta or the modest hillside villages of Boeotia, an ordinary Greek was already awake, not by choice, but by necessity. The sun itself served as an alarm clock, and it showed no mercy. The home that sheltered this sleeper was a study in survival rather than comfort. Mud bricks, dried under that same unforgiving sun, formed walls that offered little insulation against the elements. In summer, they absorbed heat throughout the day and radiated it back through the night like slowly cooling oven walls. In winter, those same walls became conduits for cold, seeping the warmth from human bodies with the efficiency of a thief. Small windows punctuated these walls, not glazed, for glass was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, but covered with wooden shutters that could be barred against animals, intruders, and the worst of the weather. These shutters also ensured that whatever light entered came in strips and slants, casting interiors into perpetual twilight. Privacy, that cherished modern commodity, was entirely unknown. Families lived, slept, ate, argued, loved, and died in spaces that would strike a contemporary observer as impossibly cramped. The same room that held the evening meal also held the sleeping mats, the storage jars, the household shrine, and quite possibly the family goat. Animals and humans coexisted in a proximity that modern hygiene standards would find alarming, but which ancient Greeks accepted as simply the texture of existence. The sleeping arrangements themselves would horrify anyone accustomed to memory foam and orthopedic support. A typical bed consisted of a thin mat stuffed with straw, reeds, or if one was fortunate, wool. This rested directly on a raised platform of packed earth or, in slightly more prosperous homes, a wooden frame. Pillows did not exist in the modern sense. Sleepers used a rolled-up cloak, a bundle of rags, or simply their own arm, wakening with stiff necks and the imprints of their own limbs pressed into their cheeks. And then there were the lice. These persistent companions of ancient life were not merely occasional nuisances but constant presences, creatures that treated human bodies as their natural habitat and feeding ground. One might wake with the telltale itching, or one might not, but the absence of sensation did not mean the absence of inhabitants. Combs for removing lice have been found in archaeological contexts across the Greek world, suggesting that this was a battle fought daily and never truly won. The first conscious moments of the day brought not the gentle transition of modern waking but an immediate confrontation with discomfort. The air, already warm or cold depending on season, carried the smells of close quarters, the breath of sleeping family members, the faint odor of last night's meal, the earthy scent of the animals, the ever-present dust that infiltrated every crack and settled on every surface. Before one could even sit up, the body announced its grievances, aching joints from the unforgiving sleeping surface, thirst from the dry air, and the pressing need to relieve oneself. But relief required effort. There were no indoor latrines, no convenient plumbing, no ceramic bowls by the bedside. Chamber pots existed in some households, but emptying them meant a journey outside, and many simply waited until they could reach the designated areas. In rural settings, this might mean a discreet spot behind the house or among the olive trees. In urban Athens, public latrines served some needs, but many people simply used the streets, which explains why ancient Greek cities, for all their philosophical brilliance and architectural achievement, smelled profoundly of human waste. The absence of running water shaped every aspect of morning routine. No taps to turn, no showers to step into, no sinks in which to splash one's face. Water had to be fetched, and fetching water was one of the first tasks of the day, typically assigned to women or slaves, who would walk to the nearest public fountain or, in rural areas, to a well or spring, carrying clay vessels balanced on shoulders or heads. These hydrii, as they were called, held perhaps 3 or 4 gallons when full, and carrying them required both strength and skill. A stumble, a misstep, a collision with a passing donkey, and the day's water supply could shatter across the ground, transforming a simple chore into a crisis. The fountains themselves were social spaces as much as practical facilities. Women gathered there not only to fill their jars but to exchange news, share gossip, and maintain the networks of information that bound communities together. In a society without newspapers, without social media, without any rapid means of communication, these daily gatherings at the water source served as vital information exchanges. Who had married, who had died, whose son had distinguished himself in battle, whose daughter had caught the eye of a promising suitor, all of this flowed through the conversations at the fountain as surely as water flowed into the jars. For those who could afford slaves, these tasks were delegated, and the morning began with relative leisure. But relative is the operative word. Even the wealthiest Greek, waking in a house with multiple rooms and servants to attend to every need, still confronted a world without modern comforts. The wealthy might have better bedding, might have slaves to fetch their water and prepare their food, might have more spacious quarters and finer possessions, but they still woke to the same sun, the same heat or cold, the same absence of plumbing and insulation and climate control that defined ancient existence. The concept of personal hygiene, as we understand it, barely existed. Morning ablutions, for those who performed them at all, consisted of little more than splashing water on face and hands from a basin. The idea of a daily bath would have seemed not only impractical but bizarrely excessive. Bathing was reserved for special occasions, for ritual purification, for the gymnasium after exercise, not for the ordinary beginning of an ordinary day. Instead, Greeks practiced a form of hygiene that strikes modern sensibilities as both ingenious and disturbing: the application of olive oil. This was not moisturizing in the contemporary sense but a deliberate technique for cleaning. Oil was rubbed into the skin, where it would collect dirt, sweat, and the day's accumulation of grime. Later, this oil would be scraped off using a strigil, a curved metal blade that removed both the oil and the adhered filth in long, satisfying strokes. The process left skin clean, or at least cleaner, but it also left bathers coated in a thin residue of oil that would gradually absorb into the skin or evaporate. This system had its logic. In a world without soap, without hot running water, without the chemical detergents we take for granted, oil provided a medium for lifting and removing dirt. The strigil, properly used, could scrape away not only oil but also sweat, dead skin cells, and the general accumulation of a day's labor. But it was not, by any modern standard, truly clean. The oil itself could turn rancid if left too long. The scraping could irritate skin. And the process, performed communally in the gymnasium or privately at home, left one feeling less like a freshly showered modern person and more like a salad being prepared for dressing. Yet this was the system that Greeks developed and perfected, and it served them well enough. The same olive oil that cleaned their skin also fueled their lamps, cooked their food, and anointed their dead. It was the Swiss Army knife of ancient substances, pressed from the fruit of trees that dotted the landscape and defined the economy. Every Greek knew the taste of olive oil, the smell of it, the feel of it on skin. It was as familiar as air. The absence of modern toilet paper would strike any time traveler as one of the most jarring aspects of ancient life. Greeks used whatever was available: stones, potsherds, pieces of cloth that would be washed and reused, or, in public latrines, a sponge on a stick that was shared among users and rinsed in a channel of running water. The communal sponge, let that image settle for a moment. The same implement, passed from stranger to stranger, dipped in the same water, serving the same purpose for countless individuals throughout the day. Hygiene, in this context, was not merely different from modern practice, it was operating on an entirely different conceptual plane. And yet Greeks were not unaware of the relationship between cleanliness and health. Hippocratic physicians advised washing as part of treatment for various conditions. Public bathhouses existed in larger cities, though they were more social than sanitary in function. The gymnasium included bathing facilities where athletes could clean themselves after exercise. But the daily shower, that automatic modern habit, was simply not part of ancient consciousness. One cleaned when cleaning was indicated, not as a matter of routine. By the time the sun had fully cleared the horizon, the average Greek had already performed more physical labor than many modern people do in an entire day. Water had been fetched, animals tended, fires rekindled from the previous night's embers, and the first tasks of the day begun. And all of this before breakfast, a meal so minimal that it barely qualified as eating. The concept of breakfast in ancient Greece would baffle anyone accustomed to the morning meal as we know it. No cereal, no eggs, no toast with butter, no coffee steaming in a favorite mug. No fruit smoothies, no yogurt parfaits, no oatmeal with brown sugar and cinnamon. Breakfast in the ancient world was fuel, pure and simple, and barely that. The staple was maza, a preparation of barley flour that could be made in various ways but most commonly took the form of flat cakes baked on hot stones or in the embers of the previous night's fire. Barley was the grain of the common people, cheaper and easier to grow than wheat, though also less prized and less pleasant to eat. It could be ground coarsely or finely, mixed with water and perhaps a little oil or honey if available, and shaped into cakes that would be cooked until firm. The result was dense, chewy, and about as exciting as eating a slightly burnt cardboard box. These barley cakes could be made in advance and stored, growing progressively staler and harder as days passed. By the time they were eaten, they might require softening in water or wine before they could be chewed without endangering teeth. And tooth health was, to put it mildly, not excellent in ancient Greece. Without modern dentistry, without fluoride, without any understanding of the bacterial causes of decay, Greeks suffered from dental problems that would send a modern person running to an emergency clinic. Teeth were worn down by the grit in flour ground on stone querns. Cavities went untreated until they destroyed the tooth entirely. Abscesses could kill. The simple act of chewing a barley cake might involve pain that would make a contemporary wince. For those who could afford something more, breakfast might include a few olives, cured in brine or packed in salt, their bitterness mellowed by processing. Figs, fresh or dried, provided sweetness and energy. Goat cheese, if one had access to goats and the knowledge to make it, added protein and fat. A few nuts, if the season was right and the squirrels had left any. But these were luxuries, not necessities. The core of breakfast remained the barley cake, and the barley cake remained profoundly unexciting. The beverage situation was even more striking. Water, as noted, was not always safe to drink. Without understanding of germ theory, Greeks nonetheless observed that some water made people sick and some did not. They preferred running water to still, spring water to river water, clear water to cloudy. But preferences could not guarantee safety, and waterborne diseases were a constant threat. The solution was wine, but not wine as we know it. Greek wine was thick, sweet, and potent, often mixed with water in proportions that would horrify a modern enophile. The typical ratio was 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine, creating a beverage that was barely alcoholic but significantly safer than plain water. The alcohol, even diluted, killed some pathogens. The process of mixing with water, if the water was boiled first, could further reduce risk. And the taste, while not exactly refreshing by modern standards, was at least more interesting than plain water. Children drank this mixture too, though in even more diluted form. The idea that wine was solely an adult beverage would have seemed strange to Greeks, who saw it as simply another component of the diet, a way to make water safer and meals more pleasant. The same symposiums where adult men debated philosophy while drinking heavily also featured wine served to boys and even, in some households, to women. It was not intoxication they sought from the morning cup but survival. The meal itself was eaten quickly, without ceremony. Greeks did not sit at tables for breakfast, did not linger over conversation, did not savor each bite. They stood or sat on simple stools, grabbed their barley cake, dipped it in watered wine, and consumed it in minutes. There were no plates in the modern sense. Flat pieces of bread could serve as edible plates, or food could be eaten directly from hands. Forks did not exist, fingers did the work that utensils would later perform. Knives, if used at all, were personal tools carried on the person, not specialized eating implements. And then there was the matter of who ate with whom. In many Greek households, particularly in Athens, men and women did not eat together. The men ate first, served by women and slaves. The women and children ate afterward, consuming what remained. This was not merely a matter of convenience but of social order, reflecting the hierarchical structure of the household and the subordinate position of women within it. The irony of the situation, that the people who had prepared the food, fetched the water, and tended the fire were also the people who ate last and least, was not lost on everyone, but it was rarely questioned. For slaves, breakfast might be even more minimal, perhaps just a piece of bread and a cup of water, eaten quickly before the day's labor began. Slaves in wealthier households might eat better than poor free people, but they ate as subordinates, at the convenience of their owners, with no rights to the food they consumed or the time they spent consuming it. The contrast with modern meals could hardly be more stark. We eat for pleasure as much as sustenance. We sit in comfortable chairs at tables set with utensils and plates. We linger over conversation and savor flavors developed by professional chefs. The ancient Greek breakfast was none of these things. It was fuel, plain and simple, consumed as quickly as possible so that the real business of the day could begin. And yet, for all its minimalism, this breakfast sustained one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history. The same people who choked down stale barley cakes in the gray light of dawn also built the Parthenon, wrote the plays of Sophocles, developed the philosophy of Plato, and laid the foundations of Western thought. They did not need elaborate breakfasts to accomplish extraordinary things. They needed only enough energy to get through the morning, and the barley cake provided that. The meal finished, our ancient Greek rises, brushes the crumbs from his tunic, and prepares to face the day. The sun is higher now, the air warmer, the streets beginning to fill with the sounds and smells of urban life. Donkeys bray, merchants shout, children run and play, and somewhere a philosopher is already gathering a crowd to debate the nature of justice. The day stretches ahead, long and hot and full of labor, and breakfast is already a distant memory. The question of clothing in ancient Greece is, on its surface, simple. Two main garments, the chiton and the himation, both essentially rectangular pieces of fabric wrapped and pinned around the body. But beneath this simplicity lies a world of social meaning, practical challenge, and daily negotiation that reveals much about how Greeks lived and what they valued. The chiton was the basic garment, worn by both men and women in various forms. It consisted of a rectangular piece of linen or wool, folded and pinned at the shoulders with brooches or fibulae, then belted at the waist to create a simple, tubular dress. The length varied. Men typically wore their chitons shorter, to the knee or above, while women's versions reached the ankles. Sleeves, when they existed at all, were created by pinning the fabric at intervals along the arm, producing a gathered effect that could be adjusted for fit and fashion. The himation was an outer garment, a larger rectangular cloth that could be wrapped around the body like a cloak or shawl. It served as coat, blanket, and occasionally as bedding, a versatile piece of fabric that could be arranged in dozens of ways depending on need and occasion. In cold weather, it could be wrapped tightly; in warm weather, draped loosely; in social situations, arranged to display wealth through quality of fabric and dye. Dye was the great differentiator. The common people wore their wool or linen in natural colors, off-white, brown, gray, because dyes cost money and faded quickly in the sun. The wealthy could afford purple, extracted laboriously from murex shellfish in a process that required thousands of creatures to produce a single garment's worth of dye. Saffron yellow, madder red, woad blue, these colors announce status as clearly as any modern designer label, marking their wearers as people who could afford not only the dye itself but the servants to maintain garments that required careful handling. The absence of underwear would strike any modern person as one of the most disconcerting aspects of ancient dress. Greeks wore nothing beneath their chitons, no underpants, no bras, no base layer of any kind. The garment wrapped around the body, pinned at the shoulders, and that was it. In windy weather, a chiton could billow and reveal more than the wearer intended. In athletic contexts, this was unremarkable. Greeks exercised and competed in the nude, seeing no shame in the unclothed body. But in daily life, the potential for accidental exposure required constant awareness and careful management. For women, this lack of undergarments created particular challenges. Menstruation, pregnancy, nursing, all had to be managed with the same basic clothing, supplemented by additional cloths and careful planning. The absence of modern sanitary products meant that women developed their own methods, using soft wool or linen rags that could be washed and reused. But these were imperfect solutions, and the reality of female life in ancient Greece involved levels of discomfort and inconvenience that modern women can barely imagine. Footwear was similarly minimal. The wealthy wore sandals, leather soles attached to the foot by straps that wound around the ankle and between the toes. These provided protection from the worst of the ground's heat and roughness, while leaving most of the foot exposed to air and dirt. The poor went barefoot, their feet toughened by years of contact with every surface imaginable: sun-baked stone, goat-trodden dirt, the waste of animals and humans alike, the sharp edges of broken pottery that littered every street. Walking barefoot through an ancient Greek city was not for the faint of heart. The streets were not paved in most areas, and even where paving existed, it was irregular and often broken. Donkeys and other animals left their droppings wherever they walked. Households threw their waste into the streets, where it accumulated until rain or scavengers removed it. Sharp objects lurked in the dust, ready to cut an unwary foot. The barefoot Greek developed calluses thick enough to withstand much of this, but cuts and infections remained constant risks. Sun protection was unknown. No hats, no sunscreen, no awareness of the long-term dangers of UV exposure. Greeks worked in the sun, walked in the sun, lived in the sun, and their skin showed it. Farmers and sailors developed leathery hides tanned by years of exposure. Wealthier individuals who could stay indoors more often retained paler skin, which became itself a marker of status, proof that one did not need to labor in the fields. But even the wealthiest Greek, venturing out on a summer day, would return with shoulders burned and face flushed. The social aspects of clothing were as important as the practical. How one dressed, how one pinned one's garments, how one walked and moved in fabric that was constantly threatening to shift or fall, these were markers of breeding and status. A well-dressed person moved with confidence, knowing that their pins would hold, their fabric would drape properly, their appearance would project the right message. A poorly dressed person might be assumed to be a slave, a foreigner, or someone of low status, with all the social consequences that entailed. For women, clothing also functioned as a form of seclusion. The respectable woman, particularly in Athens, was expected to dress modestly, to keep herself covered, to avoid attracting attention. Her himation could be drawn across her face when she ventured out, creating a portable veil that shielded her from the gaze of unrelated men. The ideal woman was seen but not noticed, present but not provocative, moving through public space like a ghost in fabric. The gymnasium presented the opposite extreme. Here, men exercised and socialized in complete nudity, their bodies on display in ways that would scandalize later cultures but seemed perfectly natural to Greeks. The word gymnasium itself comes from gymnos, meaning naked, a reminder that this institution was founded on the principle of unclothed athleticism. Young men trained alongside older mentors, their bodies developing under the sun and the eyes of their peers, in an atmosphere that blended physical culture with social bonding and sometimes with erotic attraction. This acceptance of nudity in specific contexts coexisted with elaborate norms about clothing in others. The same man who exercised naked in the gymnasium would be scandalized by improper dress in the assembly or the marketplace. The same woman who was expected to cover herself in public might participate in religious festivals where clothing was minimal or symbolic. Context governed everything, and the ability to read context, to know when to be covered and when to be bare, was essential to social competence. By the time our ancient Greek had dressed for the day, the sun was well up and the city was fully awake. The chiton was pinned, the himation arranged, the sandals strapped on or the bare feet planted firmly on the ground. It was time to go to work, and work in ancient Greece meant something very different from what it means today. The economy of ancient Greece was built on the backs of human beings, both free and enslaved. There were no machines, no automation, no labor-saving devices beyond the most basic tools. Everything that got done was done by hand, by muscle, by the coordinated effort of bodies working in unison or alone. For the vast majority of Greeks, work meant agriculture. The land was the source of wealth, the foundation of status, the subject of endless disputes and the object of constant labor. Even city dwellers often owned land outside the walls, and the ideal of the self-sufficient farmer, owning enough land to support his family, working it with his own hands and those of his slaves, remained powerful throughout Greek history. The agricultural year dictated the rhythm of life. In autumn, after the first rains softened the ground, farmers plowed their fields, using wooden plows tipped with iron that scratched shallow furrows in the thin Mediterranean soil. They sowed barley and wheat, the staffs of life, scattering seed by hand and hoping for enough rain to bring it to germination. In winter, they pruned vines and olives, the other pillars of the Greek diet, cutting back old growth to encourage new. In spring, they harvested what they had sown, cutting grain with sickles and gathering it into sheaves for threshing. In summer, they beat the grain from the chaff on threshing floors, then winnowed it in the wind, letting the breeze carry away the lighter husks and leave the heavier grain behind. This cycle repeated year after year, generation after generation, with variations only for local conditions and the whims of weather. A drought could mean famine. A good rain could mean surplus. The difference between abundance and starvation was measured in inches of rainfall and days of sunshine, and farmers watched the sky with an attention that modern weather apps have made obsolete. Olives and vines required different rhythms. Olive trees took years to mature, decades to reach full production, but once established they could live for centuries, providing oil for cooking, lighting, and hygiene year after year. Harvesting olives was labor-intensive work, requiring pickers to climb ladders and strip the fruit from branches, then transport it to presses where the oil was extracted by crushing and pressing. The process was slow, the yield uncertain, the result essential. Vines demanded even more attention. Pruning in winter, training new growth in spring, protecting developing grapes from birds and disease in summer, harvesting in autumn. The vineyard was a year-round responsibility that rewarded careful attention with wine that could be stored and traded. Good wine from a famous vineyard could travel across the Mediterranean, fetching prices that made farmers rich. Bad wine was barely drinkable, useful only for mixing with water and consuming quickly before it turned to vinegar. Beyond agriculture, Greeks worked at countless other trades. Potters shaped clay on wheels, firing their wares in kilns that reached temperatures high enough to transform soft earth into hard, durable vessels. Metalworkers smelted ore and forged tools, weapons, and decorative objects in workshops filled with smoke and noise. Leatherworkers tanned hides and crafted sandals, belts, and harnesses. Carpenters built everything from furniture to ships, using tools that had changed little in centuries. The agora, the marketplace, was the center of urban economic life. Here, farmers sold their produce, craftsmen displayed their wares, and merchants offered goods from across the Mediterranean: Egyptian grain, Phoenician purple dye, Italian wine, Black Sea fish. The agora was noisy, crowded, and chaotic, filled with the shouts of vendors, the arguments of customers, and the constant movement of people and animals. It was also a social center, a place to meet friends, exchange news, and engage in the endless conversations that characterized Greek public life. For those who could afford them, slaves performed much of the actual labor. A wealthy household might own dozens of slaves, each assigned to specific tasks: cooking, cleaning, childcare, shopping, farm work, craft production. Slaves were property, bought and sold like any other commodity, with no rights and no protections beyond the self-interest of their owners. A cruel master could beat or brand or kill a slave with impunity, while a kind one might treat slaves almost as family members. The difference was entirely a matter of individual character, not law or custom. The presence of slaves shaped the experience of free labor. The poorest free Greeks, those who had to work with their own hands, occupied an ambiguous social position. They were citizens, with rights and privileges that slaves lacked, but they did the same work as slaves and were often barely better off economically. The line between free poverty and enslaved labor could be uncomfortably thin, and free workers sometimes resented the competition from slaves who could be worked harder and paid nothing. For women, work meant domestic labor, and domestic labor in ancient Greece was anything but light. Grinding grain into flour was a daily task that required hours of kneeling at a quern, pushing a heavy stone back and forth across grain until it was reduced to powder. Fetching water meant walking to the fountain, filling heavy jars, and carrying them home, often uphill. Weaving cloth required setting up a loom, threading it with countless strands of warp, and spending hours passing the shuttle back and forth to create fabric that would become clothing, bedding, and household textiles. These tasks were not optional. They were as essential as eating and sleeping, the invisible infrastructure that kept households functioning. And they were performed by women whose work was rarely acknowledged and never compensated, whose contribution to the economy was as vital as any man's but whose names appear in no records and whose achievements survive only in the objects they left behind. Children worked too, as soon as they were able. They fetched and carried, tended animals, helped in the fields, assisted in workshops. There was no concept of childhood as a protected period of development, no sense that children should be free from labor. Poor children worked because their families needed the labor, wealthy children worked because work was what people did, and learning to do it was part of growing up. The working day was long, often beginning before sunrise and continuing until sunset. There were no weekends, no paid holidays, no concept of vacation. Religious festivals provided days off, sometimes many days, as the Athenian calendar was crowded with celebrations, but these were not rest in the modern sense so much as different kinds of activity, involving processions, sacrifices, feasting, and other forms of religious observance. By midday, the sun was at its height and the heat at its worst. In summer, this was the hour of rest, when work stopped and people retreated into shade to escape the worst of the sun. Shops closed, fields emptied, streets quieted as everyone sought whatever cool they could find. Then, as the sun began its descent, activity resumed, continuing until darkness made further work impossible. The end of the working day brought not relaxation but more work. Animals had to be fed and watered, tools cleaned and stored, the evening meal prepared. Only after all this was done could Greeks sit down to eat, and even then, the meal was not the leisurely affair we might imagine, but another task to be completed before sleep. Sleep itself was the final labor of the day, the necessary prelude to another round of waking labor. And as our ancient Greek settles onto his sleeping mat, exhausted and aching, he knows that tomorrow will be exactly the same. The sun will rise, the work will call, and another day in ancient Greece will begin. The concept of citizenship in ancient Greece was simultaneously expansive and restrictive, a paradox that defined who belonged and who did not, who could participate in the life of the polis and who could only watch from the margins. To understand ancient Greece, one must understand this central distinction, the line between those who were fully human in the political sense and those who were something less. In Athens, the most famously democratic of Greek city-states, citizenship was reserved for free men born to Athenian parents, who had completed their military training and reached the age of 18. This group, the demos from which democracy takes its name, was a minority of the total population. Women, slaves, medics, resident foreigners, and children were excluded entirely, their voices unheard in the assemblies where decisions were made and their interests unrepresented in the councils where laws were crafted. The numbers tell the story. At the height of Athens's power in the 5th century BCE, the total population may have reached 300,000 or more. Of these, perhaps 30,000 to 50,000 were adult male citizens, the only people who could vote, hold office, speak in the assembly, or participate in the legal system. Everyone else, women who managed households and raised children, medics who paid taxes and contributed to the economy, slaves who performed the labor that made everything possible, had no political rights whatsoever. This was democracy, but democracy of a very particular kind. It was rule by the people, if by the people one meant a specific subset of the population that excluded most actual human beings. The philosophers who celebrated democracy rarely questioned this exclusion, it seemed as natural to them as the air they breathed. Women were inherently unsuited to politics, they believed. Foreigners could not be trusted with Athenian interests. Slaves were slaves by nature, fitted only for labor and obedience. The idea that all humans might have equal political rights would have struck an ancient Greek as not merely wrong but incomprehensible. For those who did possess citizenship, the rights and responsibilities were extensive. A citizen could vote in the assembly, where major decisions were made by majority vote of those present. He could serve on juries, which in Athens were large bodies of citizens who decided both guilt and punishment in legal cases. He could hold public office, though many offices were filled by lottery rather than election, on the principle that any citizen was capable of serving. He could speak in the assembly, propose laws, and challenge his fellow citizens to defend their positions. But citizenship also meant obligations. The most important of these was military service. Every citizen was expected to serve in the army when called, providing his own equipment and fighting for his city. In Athens, this meant 2 years of training in the ephebeia, a kind of military academy for young men, followed by decades of being available for service whenever the city needed him. In Sparta, the demands were far more extreme, with men living in military barracks from age 7 to 30 and remaining subject to call up well into old age. The connection between citizenship and military service was not incidental but fundamental. The right to participate in political life was earned and maintained through willingness to fight and die for the city. The hoplite farmer who voted in the assembly was the same man who stood in the phalanx, shield locked with his neighbors, facing the enemy across a few yards of battlefield. His political rights and his military duties were two sides of the same coin, and neither could exist without the other. The phalanx itself was a remarkable social institution. It required cooperation, discipline, and trust, the very qualities that democracy required as well. Men who had never met fought shoulder to shoulder, their shields overlapping to create a wall of bronze and wood. They advanced together, retreated together, and if necessary died together, their bodies forming a barrier that the enemy could not cross. The phalanx was democracy in military form, a gathering of equal citizens who together created something stronger than any individual could achieve alone. Equipment for this service was provided by the soldier himself. A typical hoplite carried a large round shield, hoplon, from which the name hoplite derives, a spear of 7 to 9 feet, a short sword for close fighting, and wore a bronze helmet, breastplate, and greaves. This equipment was expensive, beyond the means of the poorest citizens, who served instead as light troops or rowers in the navy. The ability to equip oneself as a hoplite was a mark of status, proof that one belonged to the middle class of farmers and craftsmen who formed the backbone of the army. Naval service was different. The trireme, the warship that made Athens a naval power, required 170 rowers working in unison to drive it through the water. These rowers were drawn from the poorest citizens, the thetes, who could not afford hoplite equipment but could contribute their labor to the city's defense. Naval service gave these men a claim to citizenship that they might otherwise have lacked, and the growth of Athenian democracy was closely linked to the growing importance of the navy. Men who rowed the ships that protected Athens could hardly be denied a voice in its assemblies. The experience of battle in ancient Greece was terrifying beyond modern imagination. Two phalanxes would advance toward each other, spears leveled, shields raised, until they met with a crash of wood on wood and bronze on bronze. The front rank stabbed at each other over the tops of their shields, while those behind pushed forward, adding their weight to the pressure. Men fell, were trampled, died screaming. The battle became a shoving match, a test of which side could maintain its cohesion while the other broke. When a phalanx broke, the real slaughter began, as fleeing soldiers were cut down from behind by pursuing enemies. Surviving such an experience left scars that never healed. The Greeks recognized this. Their literature is full of warriors haunted by what they had seen and done, but they had no name for post-traumatic stress and no treatment for it beyond time and wine and the company of fellow veterans. A man who had fought at Marathon or Plataea might wake screaming for the rest of his life, but he would wake as a citizen, with all the rights and responsibilities that entailed. For those who did not survive, there were public funerals and commemorative speeches. The Athenian tradition of the epitaphios logos, the funeral oration delivered over the war dead, elevated individual sacrifice into collective meaning. Pericles' famous speech, as recorded by Thucydides, celebrates men who died for Athens not as victims but as heroes, whose loss is outweighed by the glory they won and the city they preserved. Whether this consolation actually comforted the families of the dead is another question. Military service was not the only obligation of citizenship. Citizens were also expected to participate in the political life of the city, attending assembly meetings, serving on juries when selected, and taking their turn at public office. In Athens, the assembly, ecclesia, met at least 40 times a year, and any citizen could attend, speak, and vote. The Pnyx, the hill where the assembly gathered, could hold perhaps 6,000 people, a small fraction of the citizen body, but enough to make decisions that affected everyone. The experience of attending the assembly was nothing like modern voting. There were no secret ballots, no private voting booths, no campaigns conducted through media. Citizens gathered, listened to speakers, shouted their approval or disapproval, and finally raised their hands to vote. The majority ruled, and the minority accepted the result, at least in theory. In practice, Athenian politics could be bitterly divisive, with factions competing for influence and individuals rising and falling based on their ability to persuade the crowd. The law courts were another arena of citizen participation. Juries in Athens were large, often 501 citizens or more, and were selected by lottery from those who showed up on the day. There were no judges in the modern sense, no legal experts to guide the jury's deliberations. The litigants spoke for themselves, presenting their cases in speeches that could last hours, and the jury voted without discussion, dropping ballots into urns to indicate guilt or innocence, and then voting again on penalty if necessary. This system placed enormous power in the hands of ordinary citizens, but it also placed enormous demands on them. Jurors had to listen carefully, weigh evidence, and make decisions that could affect lives and property. They had to resist the appeals of skilled speakers and the prejudices that everyone carries. And they had to do all this without legal training, without judicial instructions, without any of the safeguards that modern courts provide. The litigiousness of Athenians was legendary. Cases could arise from almost any dispute: property lines, inheritance, assault, fraud, impiety, political misconduct, and the courts were flooded with litigants seeking justice or revenge. Professional speechwriters, logographers, emerged to help citizens craft effective arguments, and the speeches they wrote survive as some of our best sources for Athenian social history. Beyond these regular obligations, wealthy citizens were expected to perform liturgies, public services that funded everything from warships to theatrical productions. A triarchy, for example, required a wealthy man to equip and command a trireme for a year, a financial burden that could ruin even a substantial fortune. A chorgia required funding a chorus for the dramatic festivals, paying for costumes, training, and the poet who wrote the play. These liturgies were simultaneously burdens and honors, ways for the wealthy to display their public spiritedness and compete for prestige. The system worked because citizens accepted its legitimacy. They might grumble about specific decisions or resent particular leaders, but they believed in the fundamental rightness of citizen self-government. This belief was the bedrock of Greek democracy, and it survived defeats, plagues, and periods of oligarchic reaction. When democracy was temporarily overthrown, as happened several times in Athenian history, citizens fought to restore it, not because it was perfect, but because it was theirs. The experience of citizenship was radically different for women, who were citizens in a technical sense. They were Athenian by birth, eligible to marry Athenian men and bear Athenian children, but who had none of the rights that male citizens enjoyed. Theirs was a citizenship of exclusion, defined by what they could not do rather than what they could. The ideal Athenian woman was invisible. She stayed in the women's quarters, the gynaeconitis, managed the household, raised the children, and appeared in public as little as possible. When she did go out, to fetch water, to attend a festival, to visit female relatives, she was expected to dress modestly, avoid eye contact with men, and return home as quickly as possible. The public sphere belonged to men, women belonged in private. This ideal was never fully realized in practice. Poor women had to work, fetching water and shopping in the agora because there were no slaves to do it for them. Women participated in religious festivals, sometimes in prominent roles. Women could own property, though they could not manage it without a male guardian. Women could influence their husbands and sons, shaping decisions indirectly even when they could not make them directly. But all of this happened within constraints that modern women would find intolerable. Marriage was arranged, typically when a girl was in her early teens and a man in his 30s. The bride moved from her father's house to her husband's, bringing a dowry that would be returned to her family if the marriage ended. Love was not the purpose of marriage. The purpose was to produce legitimate children who would inherit the family property and continue the family line. Love might develop, or it might not. Either way, the institution continued. Childbirth was dangerous. Without modern medicine, without hygiene as we understand it, without any way to intervene when things went wrong, women died in labor at rates that would horrify a modern obstetrician. The graves of women who died in childbirth are common in Greek cemeteries, marked with touching inscriptions that speak of lives cut short and infants left motherless. Those who survived might bear child after child, hoping that enough would live to carry on the family. The children themselves faced long odds. Perhaps 1 in 3 died before reaching adulthood, killed by disease, malnutrition, or accident. Parents who could afford it might expose unwanted infants, leaving them outside to die or be taken by slavers, a practice that was legal and widely accepted. Girls were more likely to be exposed than boys, since they would require dowries and would not carry on the family name. The survivors grew up in a world that valued them conditionally, based on their sex and their usefulness. For women who did not marry, a small minority, the options were limited. They might remain in their father's household, dependent on his charity. They might become priestesses, serving a goddess and gaining some independence in the process. They might fall into prostitution, either in brothels or as high-class courtesans, hetaira, who entertained men at symposia. None of these options offered security or respect. Sparta was different, famously, radically different. Spartan women were educated, could own and manage property, exercised in public, and were expected to be as strong and disciplined as their men. They married later, at an age when they were physically mature, and they were encouraged to speak frankly and participate in public life in ways that would have scandalized Athenians. But Spartan women's freedom served Spartan men's purposes. Their role was to produce strong warriors for the state, and their education and physical training were designed to make them better breeders. They were still excluded from political life, still subject to male authority, still defined by their relationship to men. The difference was one of degree, not kind. The gap between ideal and reality in women's lives is difficult to measure. The sources that survive were written by men, for men, and they reflect male assumptions about what women should be rather than what women actually were. Archaeological evidence complicates the picture, showing women engaged in economic activities, owning property, and leaving traces of their lives that the literary sources ignore. The truth, as always, lies somewhere in between. Citizenship also excluded the metics, the resident foreigners who lived and worked in Greek cities without enjoying the rights of citizens. In Athens, metics might be Greeks from other city-states, or they might be non-Greeks from further abroad, Phrygians, Lydians, Syrians, Egyptians. They came for trade, for work, for opportunities that their home cities could not provide. They paid taxes, served in the army, and contributed to the economy, but they could not vote, hold office, or own land. The metic population of Athens was substantial, perhaps as large as the citizen population at certain periods. Metics dominated certain trades, particularly those involving long-distance trade and specialized crafts. They brought skills and connections that enriched the city, and they were generally welcomed as long as they paid their taxes and kept out of politics. But they remained permanently foreign, unable to become citizens no matter how long they lived in Athens or how much they contributed. The status of metic was inherited. Children of metics were metics themselves, even if born in Athens. There was no path to citizenship except by special decree of the assembly, which was rarely granted. A metic might live in Athens for generations, his family contributing to the city's prosperity and serving in its defense, without ever being able to participate in its political life. This exclusion had practical consequences. Metics could not own land, so they could not farm or build houses on their own property. They had to rent, paying landlords who were citizens. They could not bring cases in court without a citizen sponsor, leaving them vulnerable to exploitation. They could be expelled at any time, for any reason, with no recourse. Their presence was tolerated but never fully accepted. And yet metics stayed, because Athens offered opportunities that other places did not. The city's wealth, its trade networks, its cultural vitality attracted people from across the Mediterranean. A skilled craftsman could make a good living in Athens even as a metic. A merchant could build a business that supported his family for generations. The price of exclusion from politics was worth paying for access to the Athenian economy. The same could not be said for slaves, who were at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Slaves had no rights at all. They were property, bought and sold like animals, subject to the will of their owners. They could be beaten, branded, raped, killed, with no legal consequences for their owners. Their children were slaves as well, born into the same condition of absolute powerlessness. The sources of slavery were various. Prisoners of war were enslaved, their capture transforming them from free people into property. Pirates and slave traders kidnapped people from vulnerable communities and sold them in slave markets. Children born to slaves were slaves themselves, adding to the slave population through reproduction. And some people sold themselves or their children into slavery to escape debt or starvation, a desperate choice that reflected the desperate conditions of ancient life. The numbers are staggering. At certain periods, slaves may have made up a third or more of the population of Athens. They worked in every sector of the economy, in agriculture, in mines, in workshops, in households. They built the temples and paved the streets. They rowed the warships and carried the supplies. They cooked the meals and raised the children. Without slaves, the Greek economy would have collapsed and Greek civilization would have been impossible. The conditions of slavery varied enormously. A slave who worked in the silver mines at Laurium faced a short, brutal life of backbreaking labor in darkness and dust. A slave who worked as a clerk or tutor in a wealthy household might live comfortably, even develop close relationships with the family. A slave who was skilled in a craft might be allowed to live independently, paying his owner a portion of his earnings and saving the rest to buy his freedom. The difference between these experiences was entirely a matter of the owner's character and the slave's luck. Manumission, the granting of freedom to slaves, was possible but rare. A slave might be freed as a reward for loyal service, or might save enough to purchase freedom, or might be freed in their owner's will. Freed slaves became medics, not citizens, and their children remained medics as well. The stain of slavery never entirely washed away. Even freed slaves were marked by their former status and faced discrimination that freeborn people did not. The philosophical justification for slavery was provided by thinkers like Aristotle, who argued that some people were slaves by nature, born with bodies suited for labor and minds incapable of rational self-governance. This argument was convenient for a society built on slavery, but it was not universally accepted. Some Greeks questioned whether slavery was just, and there were occasional movements to abolish or limit it. But these were minority views, and slavery remained fundamental to Greek civilization until the end of the ancient world. The democracy that excluded women, medics, and slaves was nevertheless a remarkable achievement, the first system of government in history that gave ordinary people a voice in their own governance. Its institutions were designed to prevent the concentration of power and to ensure that all citizens could participate. The Council of 500, Boule, prepared the agenda for the assembly and oversaw the day-to-day administration of the city. Its members were chosen by lottery from the demes, local districts, serving for 1 year and eligible to serve only twice in a lifetime. This ensured that a wide range of citizens gained experience in governance and that no one could build a power base by serving repeatedly. The generals, strategoi, were elected rather than chosen by lottery, reflecting the importance of military expertise. There were 10 generals, one from each tribe, and they commanded the army and navy, conducted foreign policy, and exercised significant influence over Athenian affairs. The most famous of these was Pericles, who led Athens for decades and shaped the city's golden age. The courts, as we have seen, were staffed by large juries of ordinary citizens. There were no professional judges, no lawyers, no appeals. The jury's verdict was final, and the jury's sentence was whatever they decided. This system gave enormous power to citizens but also placed enormous responsibility on them. A jury could condemn an innocent man to death, and there was no recourse. The assembly was the sovereign body, meeting on the Nix Hill to debate and decide the great questions of the day. Any citizen could speak, and many did, though the most effective speakers tended to be the wealthy and well-educated, who had time to prepare and skills to persuade. The assembly voted by show of hands, and the majority ruled. There were no parliamentary procedures, no rules of order beyond basic customs. The assembly was democracy in its purest, most chaotic form. This system worked because citizens took it seriously. They attended meetings, served on juries, held office when chosen. They argued about politics in the agora and discussed policy with their neighbors. They understood that the city's fate depended on their participation, and they participated accordingly. The idea of abstaining from politics, of letting others make decisions, would have seemed to them a dereliction of duty, a failure of citizenship. And yet the system had flaws that even Greeks recognized. Demagogues could sway the assembly with emotional appeals, leading to disastrous decisions. Factions could dominate politics, excluding their opponents from power. The poor could use their numbers to expropriate the rich, leading to class conflict. The Athenians experienced all of these problems at various times, and their response was not to abandon democracy but to refine it, adding new institutions and procedures, to address the weaknesses of the old. The most dramatic of these was ostracism, a procedure that allowed the assembly to exile any citizen for 10 years without trial or explanation. Once a year, the assembly voted on whether to hold an ostracism. If they voted yes, a second vote was held in which citizens wrote the name of the person they wanted exiled on a piece of broken pottery, ostracon. If someone received 6,000 votes, they had to leave Athens within 10 days and stay away for 10 years, after which they could return with no further penalty, their property intact and their rights restored. Ostracism was not punishment for crime but prevention of tyranny. It was designed to remove individuals who had become too powerful, too popular, too threatening to the democratic order. The threat of ostracism kept ambitious men in check, reminding them that the people could remove them at any time. But it also punished success and discouraged excellence, creating a culture of mediocrity that some Athenians criticized. The most famous victim of ostracism was Aristides the Just, who was so renowned for his fairness that one voter, asked why he was voting for Aristides, reportedly said, "Because I'm tired of hearing him called the Just." This story captures the paradox of ostracism. It was both a safeguard of democracy and a weapon against distinction, a way of protecting equality by punishing excellence. Themistocles, the hero of Salamis, was also ostracized, his naval victories forgotten in the politics of the moment. He ended his life as a servant of the Persian king he had defeated, a bitter end for the man who saved Greece. His fate reminded every Athenian that popularity was fleeting and that the people's favor could turn to fury without warning. For all its flaws, Athenian democracy inspired loyalty and pride. Citizens believed that their system was the best in the world, that it made them better and stronger than their rivals. They fought and died to preserve it, and when it was overthrown by oligarchs, they rose up and restored it. The democracy was not perfect, far from it, but it was theirs, and they loved it accordingly. The religious life of ancient Greece permeated every aspect of existence. There was no separation of church and state, no private sphere of belief distinct from public practice. The gods were everywhere, in the temples that dominated every city, in the statues that lined every street, in the rituals that marked every significant event. To be Greek was to worship the gods, and to worship the gods was to be Greek. The pantheon was vast and various. At its head were the 12 Olympians: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hermes, Hephaestus, and either Hestia or Dionysus, depending on the list. Each god had spheres of influence, myths that explained their character, and cults that honored them in specific ways. Zeus was king of the gods, god of sky and thunder, protector of hospitality and oaths. Hera was his wife, goddess of marriage and childbirth, jealous of Zeus's infidelities and vengeful toward his lovers. Poseidon ruled the sea, causing storms and earthquakes when angered. Athena, sprung fully armed from Zeus's head, was goddess of wisdom, craft, and war, patron of Athens and guardian of civilization. Below the Olympians were countless lesser deities, nymphs who inhabited springs and trees, river gods who embodied the waters that sustained life, spirits of place who guarded specific locations. Heroes, too, received worship, mortals who had done great deeds and been elevated to divine or semi-divine status after death. Heracles, Achilles, Theseus, these figures were honored with sacrifices and festivals, their tombs becoming places of pilgrimage and prayer. The relationship between Greeks and their gods was not one of love or faith in the modern sense. Greeks did not believe the gods were good or just or worthy of adoration. They believed the gods were powerful, and power demanded respect. A god could help you or harm you depending on your treatment of them. Neglect a sacrifice, and your crops might fail. Speak disrespectfully, and your ship might sink. Honor the gods appropriately, and they might look favorably on your endeavors. This was not faith as trust or love, but as reciprocal obligation. You gave the gods what they were due: sacrifice, prayer, festivals, and in return, they might give you what you wanted. There was no guarantee, no certainty that the gods would respond. They were not bound by morality or consistency. They could act as they pleased, and mortals could only hope to stay on their good side. Sacrifice was the central act of Greek religion. Animals, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, were led to the altar, decorated with garlands, and killed in a ritualized manner. Their blood was poured on the altar, their thigh bones wrapped in fat and burned for the gods, their meat cooked and eaten by the worshippers. The smell of roasting meat, the smoke rising to heaven, the communal feast that followed, these were the pleasures of piety, the rewards of right relationship with the divine. Festivals punctuated the calendar, providing breaks from work and opportunities for communal celebration. The Panathenea in Athens honored Athena with procession, sacrifice, and athletic competitions. The Dionysia celebrated the god of wine with dramatic performances that became the foundation of Western theater. The Eleusinian mysteries offered initiates secret knowledge and promises of a blessed afterlife. These festivals were both religious observance and civic ritual, ways of binding the community together through shared experience of the divine. Divination was another form of religious practice. Greeks believed that the gods communicated with mortals through signs, the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, the dreams that came in sleep. Oracles, most famously at Delphi, provided direct access to divine knowledge, with priestesses speaking the words of the gods in response to questions from individuals and cities alike. Before any major undertaking, war, colonization, the founding of a city, Greeks consulted the gods, seeking assurance that their plans would succeed. The absence of dogma or scripture meant that Greek religion was remarkably flexible. Different cities honored different gods in different ways, and there was no orthodoxy to enforce. You could believe what you liked about the gods as long as you participated in the rituals that honored them. Philosophers could speculate that the gods were metaphors or cosmic forces, and as long as they continued to sacrifice, they were not punished. Only those who openly rejected the gods or introduced foreign cults without permission risked prosecution, and even then, prosecution was rare and politically motivated. Socrates was the most famous exception. Condemned for impiety and corrupting the youth, he was forced to drink hemlock and died surrounded by his followers. His trial was political. He had associated with men who overthrew the democracy, but the charges were religious. Athens could tolerate philosophical speculation, but it could not tolerate apparent rejection of the gods who protected the city. Socrates' death was a warning to others who might push too far. The body that housed the citizen, the woman, the slave, the worshipper was a fragile vessel, subject to illness and injury that could strike at any time. Greek medicine was a mixture of observation, tradition, and magic, with outcomes that ranged from surprisingly effective to tragically useless. The Hippocratic physicians, active from the late 5th century BCE, represented the most rational approach to medicine in the ancient world. They rejected supernatural explanations of disease, seeking natural causes and natural treatments instead. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts associated with the school of Hippocrates, contains detailed descriptions of diseases, careful observations of symptoms, and systematic approaches to treatment. The theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, provided the framework for Hippocratic medicine. Health was balance among these humors, illness was imbalance. Treatment aimed to restore balance through diet, exercise, bathing, and, when necessary, bleeding or purging. The theory was wrong in its specifics but right in its fundamental insight, that health depends on the proper functioning of the body as a whole. Hippocratic physicians emphasized prognosis, predicting the course of a disease, over diagnosis. By observing symptoms carefully, they could tell patients and families what to expect, whether recovery or death. This gave them authority and comforted those who faced the unknown. Even when they could not cure, they could explain, and explanation was a form of healing in itself. The Hippocratic Oath, still recited by physicians today, reflects the ethical commitments of this tradition. It forbids harming patients, providing deadly drugs, or abusing the trust that patients place in their doctors. It requires physicians to keep confidential what they learn in the course of treatment. It establishes medicine as a profession with obligations beyond mere technique. But Hippocratic medicine was available only to those who could afford it. Most Greeks relied on traditional remedies, herbs known to grandmothers, prayers to healing gods, the advice of neighbors who had seen similar conditions. The sanctuary of Asclepius at Epidaurus attracted pilgrims who slept in the temple, hoping for healing dreams in which the god would appear and cure them. Inscriptions record miraculous cures, the blind seeing, the lame walking, that testify to the power of faith and the desperation of the sick. Surgery was practiced but feared. Without anesthesia, without antisepsis, without understanding of infection, surgery was a last resort for injuries that would otherwise kill. Trepanation, cutting a hole in the skull, was performed for head injuries, with some patients surviving based on archaeological evidence of healed bone. Amputations were performed with saws, the stump cauterized with hot iron to stop bleeding. The pain must have been unimaginable, and many patients died not from their original injury but from the surgery meant to save them. Childbirth was the most dangerous medical event in most women's lives. Midwives attended births, using techniques passed down through generations, but they could do little when things went wrong. A breech presentation, a stuck shoulder, a hemorrhage, these meant death for mother, child, or both. The high mortality rate around childbirth is reflected in tomb inscriptions and in the demographic structure of Greek society, with fewer adult women than men and many men remarried after their first wives died. Dentistry barely existed. Teeth decayed, abscessed, and fell out, causing pain that could last for months or years. The only treatment was extraction, performed by anyone with the strength to pull and the patient's tolerance for pain. Chewing was difficult for those who lost teeth, and nutrition suffered accordingly. The beautiful smiles of Greek statues are artistic convention, not realistic depiction. The plagues that periodically swept through Greek cities were beyond anyone's ability to treat or even understand. The most famous was the Plague of Athens, 430 to 426 BCE, which struck during the Peloponnesian War and killed perhaps a third of the population. Thucydides, who survived it, describes the symptoms in horrifying detail: fever, redness and inflammation of the eyes, bleeding from the mouth, uncontrollable diarrhea, and a desperate desire for water that led the sick to throw themselves into cisterns. Doctors died along with their patients, and the traditional remedies of religion and medicine proved useless. The social order broke down as people abandoned the sick and the dead lay unburied in the streets. The plague's effects on Athens were catastrophic. Pericles died, and with him the stable leadership that had guided the city for decades. Morale collapsed, and the Athenians' confidence in their institutions and their gods was shaken. The historian attributes the breakdown of law and morality to the plague's impact, as people decided to enjoy life while they could, since death might come at any moment. The plague was a trauma from which Athens never fully recovered. Death was everywhere in ancient Greece. Infants died, children died, women died in childbirth, men died in war, the old died of disease and gradual failure. The average life expectancy at birth was around 30 years, though those who survived childhood could expect to live into their 50s or 60s. But averages conceal the reality: death was not a distant prospect but an immediate presence, a visitor who could arrive at any moment without warning. Burial practices reflected this intimacy with death. The dead were washed, anointed, and laid out for mourning in their homes. Women led the lamentations, tearing their hair and beating their breasts in displays of grief that could be extravagantly theatrical. The funeral procession carried the body to the cemetery outside the city walls, where it was buried or cremated with appropriate rituals. Grave markers, stelae, vases, sculpted figures, commemorated the dead and marked their place in the landscape of memory. The Greeks believed that the dead continued to exist in some form, dwelling in the underworld of Hades. The soul, psyche, survived the body's death, but its existence was shadowy and diminished, a pale reflection of life, not a glorious afterlife. Only a few exceptional individuals, heroes, initiates of mystery cults, could hope for something better. Most would spend eternity as shades, drinking the blood of sacrifices to regain temporary consciousness and envying the living who still walked in the sun. This bleak view of the afterlife made death something to be feared and avoided. The Homeric heroes choose glorious death over inglorious life, not because death is good but because life without honor is worse. Achilles, given the choice between a long, obscure life and a short, glorious one, chooses glory, but he also tells Odysseus, when they meet in the underworld, that he would rather be a slave among the living than king among the dead. The afterlife is not reward but diminishment, not fulfillment but loss. Proper burial was essential to the soul's peace. The unburied dead could not enter Hades but wandered the earth, restless and angry, troubling the living until their remains were properly interred. This belief gave enormous power to families and communities, who could honor or dishonor the dead through their treatment of the body. It also created a powerful obligation to recover the bodies of soldiers killed in battle, even at great risk, and to give them the burial they deserved. The tombs themselves were places of ongoing contact between living and dead. Families visited on specific days, bringing offerings of food and drink, pouring libations through tubes that reached the buried dead. They left gifts, pottery, jewelry, figurines, that the dead might use in the afterlife. They spoke to their ancestors, asking for help or giving news of family events. The dead were not entirely gone, they remained present, watching over their descendants and receiving the honors that the living owed them. For those who could afford it, elaborate tombs proclaimed their status even in death. The classical period saw the development of grave stelae showing the dead in idealized form, beautiful, young, surrounded by family. These images comforted the living by showing the dead as they wished to remember them, not as they became in decay. They also asserted the family's continued status, their ability to honor their dead appropriately, their place in the community's hierarchy. The poorest received simpler treatment, a grave marked with a stone, or no marker at all, the body buried in a common grave with others of their class. Slaves might receive no burial at all, their bodies disposed of as waste. The inequality that marked life continued after death, with the wealthy able to purchase immortality through stone and ritual while the poor faded into anonymous dust. The Greek relationship with death was not morbid but practical. Death was inevitable, so one must prepare for it, honor it, and continue living in its shadow. The philosophers offered various consolations. Epicurus taught that death was nothing to us, since when we are, death is not, and when death is, we are not. The Stoics taught that death was natural and therefore not to be feared. The skeptics suspended judgment about what came after, focusing on living well in the present. But these philosophical consolations were for the educated few. Most Greeks faced death as their ancestors had, with fear, with ritual, with hope that the gods would be merciful and the dead would rest in peace. They lived their short lives with intensity, knowing that death could come at any moment, and they filled the world with beauty, temples, statues, poems, plays, as a defense against oblivion. The mortality that surrounded them made their achievements more remarkable, not less. Knowing that life was short and death certain, they chose to build, to create, to fight, to love with an intensity that later ages would marvel at. The Parthenon, the plays of Sophocles, the philosophy of Plato, these were not the products of people who expected to live forever but of people who knew they would die and wanted to leave something behind that would outlast them. And so they did. 2.5 millennia later, we still read their words, study their thoughts, admire their art. They are dead, all of them, but they are not gone. Their voices speak across the centuries, telling us what it meant to be human in a world without modern comforts, without modern medicine, without modern certainties, but with all the passion, intelligence, and creativity that humans have always possessed. The ancient Greek would not understand our world, its technology, its complexity, its comforts. But we can understand theirs, if we make the effort. We can imagine waking in a mud brick house, eating barley bread, walking barefoot through dusty streets, fearing the gods and hoping for their favor. We can imagine fighting in the phalanx, dying in plague, mourning our children, building temples that will outlast us. We can imagine all of this because, beneath the surface differences, we share the same humanity, the same hopes and fears, the same capacity for love and loss, the same desire to leave something behind when we are gone. The Greeks would not recognize us, but they would recognize our struggles. They would understand our fear of death, our love of beauty, our need for meaning. They would see in us what we see in them, a reflection of ourselves, distorted by time and difference but still recognizable. And they would nod, perhaps, and offer us a cup of wine, and invite us to sit and talk about what it means to be human. That conversation has been going on for 2,500 years. It will continue as long as humans exist. And in that continuity, the Greeks are not dead but living, their voices carried forward by all of us who still listen, still learn, still wonder at the strange and beautiful thing that is human existence. The story of Boudica begins not with her famous revolt but with a death, the death of a king who trusted Rome and paid for that trust with everything his people held dear. Strigils, ruler of the Iceni tribe in what is now eastern England, had spent his reign walking the tightrope that client kingship required. He had submitted to Roman authority, paid his taxes, kept his people peaceful, and in return had been allowed to rule his territory with relative autonomy. It was a bargain that many British leaders had made, trading complete independence for survival in the shadow of the empire. By the standards of client kings, Prasutagus had done well. The Iceni had prospered under his rule, their territory untouched by the direct Roman military occupation that had crushed other tribes. They had grown wealthy through trade with the Roman province, their nobles adopting Roman customs and luxuries while maintaining their British identity. Prasutagus himself had accumulated considerable wealth, gold, silver, livestock, land, that he hoped to pass on to his heirs. But Prasutagus knew that Rome's tolerance had limits. When he died, his kingdom would be at risk. The Romans did not recognize hereditary succession among client kings unless they chose to. They could annex his territory, reduce his people to provincial status, absorb everything he had built into the maw of the empire. To prevent this, Prasutagus made what he thought was a clever move. He named the Roman emperor as co-heir alongside his two daughters. In his will, Prasutagus bequeathed half his kingdom and personal wealth to the Emperor Nero, and the other half to his daughters. This was meant as a gesture of loyalty, a recognition that Rome had ultimate authority over his people. It was also meant to protect his daughters, ensuring that they would inherit under Roman protection. Prasutagus believed he had found a way to preserve his dynasty and his people's autonomy within the framework of Roman rule. He was catastrophically wrong. The Romans did not honor the will. They did not recognize Prasutagus's right to dispose of his kingdom as he wished, nor did they care about the welfare of his daughters. What they saw was an opportunity, a wealthy kingdom ripe for plunder, with a power vacuum that they could fill. The Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, moved quickly to assert imperial control. The Iceni kingdom was annexed outright. Roman officials and soldiers poured in to take possession of lands, livestock, and treasures. When Prasutagus's family objected, when they pointed to the will and the emperor's supposed protection, they were met with contempt. The Romans did not negotiate with natives, did not respect their customs, did not care about their laws. The Iceni were subjects now, not allies, and subjects had no rights. What happened next would transform a grieving widow into a warrior queen and ignite a rebellion that nearly drove Rome from Britain. Boudica, Prasutagus's wife, was a woman of formidable presence. The Roman historian Cassius Dio, writing more than a century later, described her in terms that suggest both fear and admiration. In stature she was very tall, in appearance most terrifying, in the glance of her eye most fierce, and her voice was harsh. A great mass of the tawniest hair fell to her hips, around her neck was a large golden necklace, and she wore a tunic of divers colors over which a thick mantle was fastened with a brooch. This was her invariable attire. This description, written by an enemy, conveys the impact Boudica made on those who encountered her. She was not a woman to be ignored or dismissed, not a queen who would fade quietly into obscurity. She was a force of nature, and the Romans were about to discover what happened when forces of nature were crossed. The Roman response to Iceni resistance was brutal and deliberate. Boudica was publicly flogged, a punishment normally reserved for slaves and the lowest classes, deliberately chosen to humiliate her and demonstrate her complete powerlessness. Her daughters, still children, were raped by Roman soldiers in front of her. This was not random violence but calculated terror, a message to every British tribe that resistance was futile and that Rome would stop at nothing to enforce its will. The message was received, but not in the way the Romans intended. Instead of breaking Boudica, the violence against her and her daughters forged her into something new. The grief and humiliation she suffered did not crush her spirit but ignited it. She became not just a queen seeking revenge for personal wrongs but a symbol of everything the Romans had done to every British tribe: the land seized, the people enslaved, the gods insulted, the leaders humiliated. Her pain became their pain, her rage their rage. Word of the Romans' actions spread quickly through the networks of trade and kinship that connected the British tribes. The Iceni, already furious at the annexation of their kingdom, were ready to fight. But Boudica knew that her tribe alone could not defeat Rome. She needed allies, and she needed a cause that would unite tribes that had spent generations fighting each other. She found both in the shared hatred of Roman rule. The Trinovans, neighbors to the Iceni, had their own reasons to hate Rome. Their former capital, Camulodunum, modern Colchester, had been turned into a Roman colony for veteran soldiers. The veterans had been granted land that once belonged to Trinovantian nobles, and they treated the native population with contempt. The Temple of Claudius, built in the center of the colony, was a constant reminder of Roman domination, and was staffed by priests who extracted heavy fees from the local population for the privilege of worshipping the deified emperor who had conquered them. Other tribes had similar grievances. The Corieltovi, the Cornovii, parts of the Brigantes, all had felt the weight of Roman rule, all had seen their land seized, their leaders humiliated, their young people taken as slaves. The Romans had divided and conquered, playing tribes against each other and rewarding collaborators. But now they had given the Britons something they had never had before, a common enemy and a leader who could unite them. Boudica traveled among the tribes, speaking in assemblies and war councils. She did not promise easy victory or guarantee safety. She promised something more powerful, the chance to die with honor rather than live as slaves. She invoked the ancestors, the gods, the sacred groves where druids communed with spirits. She reminded her listeners of their warrior traditions, their history of resistance, their duty to their children and their children's children. The Roman historian Tacitus, drawing on accounts from both sides, records a speech that Boudica supposedly gave to her assembled forces. Whether or not she spoke these exact words, they capture the spirit of her cause. This is not the first time that the Britons have been led to battle by a woman. But now she is not fighting for her kingdom or her wealth. She is fighting as an ordinary person for her lost freedom, her bruised body, and her outraged daughters. The Romans' arrogance has gone too far. They will not stop until they have taken everything. But we Britons are used to women commanders in war. I am not fighting for my empire now, but for my freedom. Let the men live as slaves if they want. We women will show them what freedom means. The response was overwhelming. Warriors flocked to her standard from across eastern Britain. Farmers left their fields, craftsmen abandoned their workshops, hunters set down their bows and picked up spears. Women, too, joined the cause, not as camp followers but as fighters, inspired by their queen to take up arms alongside their men. The army that gathered under Boudica's command was the largest force Britain had seen in generations, perhaps as many as 100,000 warriors. They were not a professional army. They had no uniform equipment, no standardized training, no chain of command beyond tribal loyalties and personal followings. They carried whatever weapons they could find or make, spears, swords, axes, slings, even farming tools pressed into service as instruments of war. Their shields were wooden, their armor minimal or non-existent. They had no cavalry to speak of, no siege engines, no logistics system to supply such a massive force. What they had was rage at what had been done to their queen, their families, their lands. Rage at years of humiliation and exploitation. Rage at an empire that treated them as less than human. And they had Boudica, riding before them in her war chariot, her daughters beside her, her hair streaming in the wind, her voice carrying across the host like a war trumpet. The Roman province of Britain was about to face its greatest test. The first target was Camulodunum, the former Trinovantian capital turned Roman colony. It was a symbol of everything the Britons hated, a city built on their land, populated by their conquerors, dominated by a temple to the man who had made them slaves. And it was vulnerable. The colony had no walls. The Romans, confident in their power and contemptuous of British resistance, had not bothered to fortify their settlement. The veterans who lived there were old men, their fighting days behind them. The few soldiers stationed in the city were inadequate to defend its perimeter. When word arrived that Boudica's army was approaching, panic spread through the Roman population. They sent urgent pleas for help to the Roman procurator, Catus Decianus, whose greed and brutality had sparked the rebellion. Decianus responded by sending, not soldiers, but 200 poorly equipped auxiliaries, a token force that could do nothing against the tens of thousands bearing down on the city. It was an insult, and it was also a death sentence for the colony. The Britons descended on Camulodunum like a tide. There was no siege, no careful military operations, just a flood of warriors pouring into the undefended streets, killing everyone they found. The Roman veterans, who had spent years lording it over the native population, died in their homes or in the streets, their bodies left where they fell. Their wives and children died with them, victims of a vengeance that made no distinction between guilty and innocent. The Temple of Claudius became a fortress of last resort. The surviving Romans and their families barricaded themselves inside, hoping that its thick walls would protect them. For 2 days, they held out while the Britons surrounded the building and tried to find a way in. On the second day, the Britons breached the defenses. What followed was slaughter. The temple, symbol of Roman domination, became a tomb. Tacitus describes the scene with his usual conciseness: they did not take prisoners, sell slaves, or exchange captives. They hurried to kill by hanging, fire, and cross, as if avenging in advance the punishment they knew was coming. The Romans who had escaped the initial massacre were hunted down and killed. The city was burned to the ground, its destruction so complete that archaeologists have found a layer of ash and destruction debris that marks the moment of its fall. News of Camulodunum's destruction spread through the province like wildfire. Roman settlers in other towns panicked, uncertain whether they would be next. The governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, was far away in western Britain, leading a campaign against the Druids on the island of Mona, modern Anglesey. He had stripped the province of troops for this expedition, leaving the eastern settlements dangerously exposed. Boudica did not pause to consolidate her victory. She understood that speed was essential, that every day she waited gave the Romans time to organize a response. Her army, swollen with new recruits drawn by news of the victory, turned south toward Londinium, the commercial heart of Roman Britain. Londinium was not a military base or a colony of veterans. It was a trading city, founded barely 17 years earlier, filled with merchants, shopkeepers, and administrators who had come to Britain to make their fortunes. It had no walls, no garrison, no defenses of any kind. Its population was a mix of Romans, Greeks, Gauls, and other foreigners, people who had no connection to the land they lived on and no claim on the loyalty of the Britons who surrounded them. When Suetonius, racing back from Wales with a small force of cavalry, reached Londinium ahead of Boudica's army, he faced an impossible choice. He could try to defend the city with the few troops he had, guaranteeing its destruction and the loss of his entire force. Or he could abandon it, saving his soldiers for future battles but condemning the inhabitants to death. He chose to abandon it. The civilians of Londinium were given the choice of leaving with the army or staying to face whatever came. Many chose to stay, unable to believe that their city, their homes, their businesses could simply be abandoned. Others tried to flee, clogging the roads with wagons and carts, carrying whatever they could save. Suetonius and his cavalry rode out, leaving Londinium to its fate. Boudica's army arrived days later. What happened next was not a battle but an extermination. The Britons swept through the undefended streets, killing everyone they found. Men, women, children, no one was spared. The bodies piled up in the streets and in the buildings where people had tried to hide. The city was set on fire, its wooden buildings burning with an intensity that melted glass and twisted metal. Archaeological excavations have found layers of red ash from this destruction, along with the skeletons of those who died, their bones showing signs of violent death and burning. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing perhaps 50 years later, estimated that 70,000 Romans and their allies died in the destruction of the three cities, Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium, St. Albans, which fell next. Whether this number is accurate or exaggerated, it conveys the scale of the disaster. Britain had seen nothing like it before, and Rome had seen nothing like it since the darkest days of the Republic. Verulamium, like the others, was undefended and unsuspecting. Its inhabitants, mostly Romanized Britons and Gallic traders, had perhaps thought themselves safe because of their distance from the initial rebellion. They were wrong. Boudica's army swept through the town, killing and burning with the same ferocity they had shown elsewhere. The layer of ash from this destruction still lies beneath the modern city, a reminder of the fire that once consumed it. By the time the slaughter ended, 3 Roman settlements had been destroyed, tens of thousands were dead, and the Roman presence in Britain hung by a thread. The province that had taken decades to subdue had been reduced, in a matter of weeks, to a few strongholds and the army in the field. If Boudica could destroy that army, Britain would be free. The Roman response to the disaster was panic, at least initially. News of the revolt reached Rome, and the Emperor Nero is said to have considered withdrawing entirely from Britain. The province had never been profitable, had always required more in military expenditure than it returned in. Taxes. Perhaps it was time to cut losses and pull back to the continent. But withdrawal was not the Roman way. Defeat was not acceptable, especially not defeat at the hands of barbarians led by a woman. Suetonius, whatever his responsibility for the disaster, was given the chance to redeem himself. He began gathering his forces, summoning legions from their bases across the province. The Roman army in Britain consisted of 4 legions, about 20,000 legionaries, plus auxiliary troops of similar number. Suetonius had with him the 14th Legion and parts of the 20th, plus auxiliaries, perhaps 10,000 men in total. The 2nd Legion, based at Exeter, failed to respond to his summons. Its commander, Poenius Postumus, either couldn't reach Suetonius in time or chose not to try. The 9th Legion, based at Lincoln, had been destroyed in an earlier ambush while trying to relieve Camulodunum. Suetonius had about 10,000 men. Boudica had perhaps 10 times that number. The odds were staggering, but Suetonius had advantages that numbers alone could not overcome. His men were professionals, trained from youth in the arts of war. They were equipped with the best weapons and armor the ancient world could produce. They were disciplined, capable of maneuvering as a unit and maintaining formation even in the chaos of battle. And they were led by a commander who understood that this fight would determine the future of Roman Britain. Suetonius chose his battlefield carefully. He needed a place where Boudica's numbers would be a disadvantage, where the ground would favor his disciplined infantry over her wild charges. He found it somewhere in the Midlands. The exact location is unknown, a narrow defile with woods on one side and perhaps a river on the other. The ground narrowed so that Boudica's army could not deploy its full width, while his own troops could form a compact line with their flanks protected. Boudica's army approached in high spirits, confident after their string of victories. They brought their families with them, women, children, and old people following the army in wagons, expecting to witness the final destruction of the Roman forces. These wagons would prove fatal, blocking escape routes and turning the battlefield into a trap. Before the battle, Boudica addressed her troops. Tacitus gives her a speech that captures the stakes. This is not the first time the Britons have followed a woman to war. But now I fight not for my kingdom or my wealth, but as one of the people, for my lost freedom, my battered body, and my outraged daughters. The Romans' arrogance has gone too far. They will never stop until they have taken everything. But we Britons are used to women commanders in war. I am not fighting for my empire now, but for my freedom. Whether these were her actual words or Tacitus's invention, they convey the spirit that drove her army. These were not professional soldiers fighting for pay or glory. They were farmers, craftsmen, hunters, ordinary people who had been pushed too far and were fighting for their homes, their families, their way of life. Suetonius addressed his troops differently. He reminded them of their training, their discipline, their superiority to the barbarian horde facing them. He told them to ignore the enemy's numbers, to focus on the men immediately before them, to hold their formation and trust in their comrades. He knew that his soldiers, outnumbered 10-1, needed confidence in their own abilities and their commander's plan. The battle began with Boudica's charge. Her warriors rushed forward, screaming war cries and beating their weapons against their shields. The sound must have been terrifying, the roar of tens of thousands of voices, the clash of metal on wood, the thunder of feet on the ground. They expected the Roman line to break, as it had broken at Camulodunum and Londinium. They expected another easy victory. But the Romans did not break. They held their formation, shields locked, spears leveled, waiting for the order to engage. When the Britons reached them, they met a wall of iron and discipline. The front ranks of the Roman line stabbed with their short swords, gladii, each thrust finding flesh. The Britons, armed with longer swords designed for slashing, found themselves too close to use them effectively. They died in waves, their bodies piling up in front of the Roman line. The narrow battlefield worked against them. Their numbers, instead of helping, became a liability. Warriors behind pushed forward, unable to see what was happening, crushing their own front ranks against the Roman shields. The wagons carrying their families blocked any retreat. When the Romans finally advanced, stepping over the bodies of the dead to press the attack, the Britons broke. What followed was slaughter. The Romans pursued the fleeing Britons, cutting them down without mercy. Men, women, children, it made no difference. The army that had destroyed 3 cities was itself destroyed, its survivors scattered across the countryside, its leader vanished into the chaos. Tacitus gives the numbers, 80,000 Britons dead, against only 400 Romans. These numbers are almost certainly exaggerated, but they convey the scale of the Roman victory. Boudica's great rebellion had ended, not in freedom for Britain, but in the worst defeat the island had ever seen. Boudica herself survived the battle, only to disappear from history. According to Tacitus, she took poison rather than be captured. According to Cassius Dio, she fell ill and died, and was given a lavish burial by her followers. The truth is unknown. No grave has ever been found, no artifact identified as hers. She simply vanishes, leaving behind only her legend. The aftermath of the rebellion was brutal. Suetonius, determined to ensure that such a revolt could never happen again, conducted a campaign of terror against the surviving Britons. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, prisoners executed. The Roman revenge was as thorough as Boudica's had been, and it left a scar on the British landscape that would take generations to heal. The Roman administration was reformed. The procurator Catus Decianus, whose greed had sparked the revolt, fled to Gaul. A new governor, more diplomatic than Suetonius, was sent to replace him. The new policy emphasized cooperation over confrontation, seeking to win over British elites with promises of Roman citizenship and participation in imperial government. Within a generation, Britons were serving in the Roman army, sitting in town councils, and even entering the Roman Senate. But the memory of Boudica never died. Among the Britons, she was remembered as a hero who had dared to defy the empire, who had united tribes that had never united before, who had made Rome bleed. Her story was passed down through generations, growing in the telling, until she became more legend than historical figure. And the Romans, too, remembered. Tacitus's account, written 50 years after the revolt, treats Boudica with a respect unusual in Roman histories of barbarian enemies. He acknowledges the justice of her cause, the brutality of the Romans who provoked her, the courage she showed in defeat. Even in victory, the Romans could not entirely dismiss the queen who had nearly driven them from Britain. The Boudican revolt was the closest Britain ever came to freeing itself from Roman rule. Had Boudica won at the final battle, had Suetonius's smaller force been overwhelmed, the Roman presence in Britain might have collapsed entirely. The legions were spread thin, the province was in chaos, and Nero was considering withdrawal. A decisive British victory could have ended Roman Britain before it was properly established. But Boudica lost, and Roman Britain continued for another 3.5 centuries. The province was never again threatened by a revolt of similar scale. The Romans learned from their mistake, treating their British subjects with more care, incorporating them into the imperial system rather than simply exploiting them. Britain became a normal Roman province, with towns, villas, and all the apparatus of Roman civilization. Yet the revolt left its mark. The destruction of the three cities was never entirely forgotten. Londinium was rebuilt and became the provincial capital, but the memory of its burning lingered. Camulodunum never fully recovered its importance, remaining a small town rather than the great city it might have become. Verulamium rebuilt and prospered, but its citizens remembered the fire that had consumed their ancestors. The rebellion also shaped Roman policy in Britain. After Boudica, Roman governors were more careful about how they treated native populations. They cultivated local elites, granted citizenship more freely, and integrated Britons into the imperial system rather than treating them as conquered subjects. The policy worked. Britain became one of the most thoroughly Romanized provinces in the Western Empire, its people adopting Roman customs, language, and identity over the centuries that followed. Boudica herself passed into legend. In the Middle Ages, she was remembered in Welsh and British folklore, though her story became confused with other figures from British tradition. Geoffrey of Monmouth, writing in the 12th century, included her in his History of the Kings of Britain, though he called her Voada and got many details wrong. She remained a shadowy figure, known only to scholars and chroniclers. The Renaissance brought renewed interest in classical sources. When Tacitus's Annals and Histories were rediscovered and published, Boudica's story emerged from the shadows. Scholars were struck by the dramatic tale, the wronged queen, the brutal Romans, the massive revolt, the tragic end. Poets and playwrights began to adapt her story, seeing in it themes that resonated with their own times. The Victorian era made Boudica an icon. In an age of empire, she became a symbol of noble resistance to oppression, though the Victorians, themselves imperialists, had to be careful how they told her story. They emphasized her courage and patriotism while downplaying the brutality of her revolt. They celebrated her as a British hero while ignoring the fact that she was fighting against the ancestors of the Romans, whom the Victorians claimed as their own cultural forebears. The most famous Victorian monument to Boudica stands on the Thames Embankment in London, near Westminster Bridge. The bronze statue, created by Thomas Thornycroft and completed in 1905, shows Boudica standing in a war chariot, her daughters beside her, her arm raised in defiance. The chariot is equipped with scythes on its wheels, a detail from Roman sources that may or may not be accurate. Below the statue is an inscription from the Victorian poet William Cowper. Regions Caesar never knew. Thy posterity shall sway. The statue captures the Victorian view of Boudica, a national heroine, a symbol of British resistance to foreign domination, a foremother of empire. It ignores the complexity of her story, the massacres she committed, the terror she inspired, the ultimate failure of her cause. It presents her as a pure symbol, stripped of historical ambiguity. Modern scholarship has attempted to recover the real Boudica, or at least to understand what can be known about her. The Roman sources, Tacitus and Cassius Dio, remain the only contemporary accounts, and they must be used with caution. Both wrote long after the events they describe, both had their own agendas, both were writing for Roman audiences with Roman assumptions. They tell us what Romans thought about Boudica, not necessarily what she was really like. Archaeology has provided some confirmation of the literary accounts. The destruction layers at Colchester, London, and St. Albans match the dates of the revolt. Coins, pottery, and other artifacts found in these layers help establish the chronology of events. Excavations have also revealed something of pre-Roman British society, the world that Boudica came from and tried to preserve. But much remains unknown. We do not know exactly where the final battle was fought. We do not know what happened to Boudica's daughters. We do not know the names of any of the other British leaders who fought with her. We do not even know for certain what she looked like. Dio's description may be based on earlier sources or may be his own invention. What we know is the story, and the story has proven more powerful than any facts could be. Boudica has become a symbol of resistance, of courage, of the power of the oppressed to strike back at their oppressors. She has been claimed by feminists, by nationalists, by anti-imperialists, by everyone who sees in her story a reflection of their own struggles. She has also been commercialized. Her image appears on everything from tea towels to beer bottles. Tourists can take Boudica tours of Colchester and London. Her name is used to sell products, to brand businesses, to attract visitors. The warrior queen has become a commodity, her story packaged and sold like any other product. Yet beneath all the layers of interpretation and appropriation, the core of the story remains powerful. A woman, wronged beyond bearing, rises up against the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. She unites her people, leads them to victory after victory, and comes within a hair's breadth of success. She loses in the end, but she loses on her own terms, refusing to be captured, refusing to be paraded in triumph through the streets of Rome. That story resonates because it speaks to something deep in human experience. The feeling of being wronged, the desire for revenge, the hope that even the most powerful can be brought down, these are universal emotions, and Boudica embodies them. She is the underdog who fights back, the victim who becomes victor, the woman who refuses to be defined by her suffering. In the end, that may be why we remember her. Not because she won, she didn't. Not because she was a great military leader, she may have been, or she may have been carried along by events beyond her control. Not because she represents anything simple or easy, she doesn't. We remember her because her story is true in a deeper sense than historical accuracy. It is true to the human experience of injustice and resistance. It is true to the hope that even the powerless can strike back at the powerful. It is true to the courage that ordinary people can find when pushed beyond endurance. And so Boudica lives on, in statues and books, in films and plays, in the imaginations of everyone who has ever dreamed of fighting back. She is gone, but she is not dead. Her fire still burns, 2,000 years after it set Roman Britain ablaze. On the island of Lesbos, in the 7th century BCE, a girl was born who would become one of the most famous poets in history, though almost nothing is known about her life, and only fragments of her work survive. Her name was Sappho, and she has been called the 10th Muse, the greatest woman poet of antiquity, the inventor of lyric poetry as we know it. She has also been called a scandal, a sinner, a figure of shame. She has been translated, adapted, appropriated, and misunderstood for 2,500 years. And through it all, her voice, fragmented, elusive, haunting, has never been silenced. The island of Lesbos, Sappho's home, was not the remote outpost that its modern name might suggest. It was a cultural center of the Greek world, famous for its poetry and music. The lyric tradition flourished there, producing poets whose work was known throughout Greece. Sappho was part of this tradition, writing in the Ialic dialect of her homeland, setting her words to music played on the lyre. The lyric was a new form of poetry, distinct from the epic tradition of Homer. Where Homer told long stories of gods and heroes in dactylic hexameter, lyric poets wrote shorter, more personal verses, expressing individual emotion and experience. They wrote about love and loss, desire and disappointment, the pleasures and pains of being human. They wrote in the first person, speaking directly to their audience, creating an intimacy that epic could not achieve. Sappho perfected this form. Her poems are short, vivid, emotionally intense. They capture moments, a glimpse of a beloved, a memory of happiness, a pang of jealousy, and hold them up to the light. They are personal without being confessional, universal without being abstract. Reading them, even in translation, even in fragments, is like overhearing someone speak from the heart. Very little is known about Sappho's life. She was born around 630 BCE, probably into an aristocratic family. She may have had brothers. One of them, Caraxes, is mentioned in a recently discovered fragment. She may have had a daughter, named Clays after her mother. She may have been exiled to Sicily for a time, caught up in the political conflicts that divided Lesbos. She may have lived to old age, writing poetry until the end. Beyond these bare facts, everything is speculation. The ancient sources that mention Sappho are late and unreliable, full of gossip and invention. Comic poets made jokes about her. Hellenistic scholars debated her biography. Roman writers moralized about her. None of them knew much more than we do, and all of them had agendas that colored what they wrote. What we know for certain is that Sappho was famous in antiquity. Her poems were collected into 9 books in the Great Library of Alexandria. She was quoted by Plato, who called her the 10th Muse. She was imitated by Catullus and other Roman poets. She was studied by scholars and performed by musicians. For centuries after her death, her work was read, copied, and admired throughout the Greek and Roman worlds. Then, slowly, she began to disappear. The reasons for Sappho's disappearance are complex. The decline of the classical world, the rise of Christianity, the changing tastes of readers, all played a role. Her poetry, written in a dialect that became harder to understand, copied on papyrus that rotted and burned, was gradually lost. By the Middle Ages, only quotations in other authors preserved any of her work. Her 9 books had been reduced to fragments. The survival of those fragments is itself remarkable. They come from many sources: quotations in ancient grammarians, citations in rhetorical handbooks, scraps of papyrus found in the sands of Egypt. Some were preserved because they were useful for teaching Greek. Others survived because they were quoted by later authors who happened to be read. A few were discovered by archaeologists digging in ancient rubbish heaps, where they had been discarded 1,000 years before. The result is a body of work that is tantalizingly incomplete. We have one complete poem, the Ode to Aphrodite, and perhaps one other. We have dozens of fragments, some as short as a single word, others running to several stanzas. We have quotations that may or may not be accurate, attributions that may or may not be correct, and gaps where whole poems have been lost. Yet even in fragments, Sappho's voice is unmistakable. It is intimate, direct, passionate. It speaks of love in ways that feel modern, that transcend the centuries and speak directly to the human heart. It is this voice that has kept Sappho alive, that has drawn readers to her for 2,000 years, that has made her one of the most beloved poets in history. Sappho's poetry is remarkable for its emotional intensity and its technical skill. She writes about love, desire, longing, jealousy, loss, with a clarity that cuts through time. Her poems are full of vivid images: the moon among the stars, the apple left on the highest branch, the hyacinth trampled underfoot. She captures the physical sensations of emotion, the trembling body, the failing voice, the fire under the skin. The most famous of her poems, the Ode to Aphrodite, is a prayer to the goddess of love. Sappho asks Aphrodite to come to her, as she has come before, and help her win the love of a woman who has rejected her. The poem is structured as a dialogue, with Sappho speaking and Aphrodite responding. The goddess is portrayed as smiling, indulgent, familiar, not a distant deity but a presence who knows Sappho's heart. The poem survives complete because it was quoted by the ancient critic Dionysius of Halicarnassus as an example of perfect style. It is written in Sappho's characteristic meter, 3 long lines followed by a shorter one, which came to be called Sapphic stanza and was imitated by later poets. It captures the essence of Sappho's art, the combination of personal emotion with formal control, the direct address to divine powers, the hope that love can be won through prayer. Other fragments are equally powerful. In one, Sappho describes the effect of seeing a beloved woman. He seems to me equal to the gods, that man who sits facing you and listens nearby to your sweet speaking and lovely laughter. It sets my heart a tremble in my breast. When I see you, even for a moment, I can no longer speak. But my tongue is broken, a subtle fire runs under my skin, I cannot see with my eyes. My ears hum, sweat pours from me, a trembling seizes me all over, I am greener than grass. And I seem to myself little short of dying. This fragment, known as Fragment 31, is one of the most famous in all of Greek poetry. It describes the physical symptoms of love with a precision that later poets would imitate but never surpass. The broken tongue, the fire under the skin, the humming ears, the trembling, these are not metaphors but physical sensations, rendered with clinical accuracy. The poem has been translated countless times, adapted by Catullus and others, and remains a touchstone of erotic poetry. In another fragment, Sappho addresses a woman who is leaving. "Honestly, I wish I were dead. She was leaving me, weeping many tears. And she said, 'Oh, what terrible things we suffer.' Sappho. I leave you against my will. And I answered, 'Go, and be happy. But remember me, for you know how we cherished you. And if you don't, I want to remind you of the beautiful times we shared.'" The fragment breaks off here, but the emotion is clear. Sappho is saying goodbye to someone she loves, acknowledging the pain of separation while asking to be remembered. The tone is intimate, personal, direct, as if we are overhearing a conversation rather than reading a poem. Other fragments capture moments of joy, the beauty of a woman walking, the pleasure of a garland worn in the hair, the sweetness of apples left on the tree. Sappho's world is filled with beautiful things, flowers, jewelry, moonlight, music. She celebrates the pleasures of life even as she acknowledges its pains. The world of Sappho's poetry is a world of women. She writes about women, addresses women, praises women. The men in her poems are peripheral. The man who sits facing you, in fragment 31, is a foil, not a subject. The emotional center of her work is female desire, female friendship, female community. This has made Sappho controversial from antiquity to the present. In a world where women's voices were rarely heard, where female desire was usually silenced or pathologized, Sappho spoke openly and unashamedly about loving women. She did not apologize or explain. She simply wrote what she felt. Later ages struggled with this. Some tried to explain it away. Perhaps Sappho was a teacher, and her poems were simply expressions of pedagogical affection. Perhaps she was a priestess, and her love was religious rather than sexual. Perhaps the poems were not about real women but about abstractions. These explanations say more about the discomfort of later readers than about Sappho herself. Others embraced Sappho's queerness. From the Hellenistic period onward, she was celebrated as a poet of same-sex love. The word lesbian derives from her island, and sapphic from her name. She became an ancestor and an icon for generations of women who loved women, a voice from the past that validated their own desires. The truth is that we cannot know exactly what Sappho's relationships were like. The ancient evidence is too sparse, the poems too fragmentary. But we can know what her poetry says, and what it says is this: women can love women, can desire them, can celebrate them, can mourn them. That was a radical statement in the 7th century BCE, and it remains radical today. Sappho's influence on later literature has been immense. In antiquity, she was admired by poets and scholars. Plato called her the 10th muse, placing her among the divine. Hellenistic poets imitated her style and meter. Roman poets translated and adapted her work. Her sapphic stanza became a standard meter for Latin poetry, used by Catullus and Horace. After the decline of the classical world, Sappho was largely forgotten in the West. Her poems were lost, her name survived only in quotations. In the Byzantine world, some knowledge of her work persisted, but it was limited. By the time of the Renaissance, she was known mainly as a name, a figure from antiquity whose work had disappeared. The rediscovery of Sappho began in the Renaissance, when scholars started to collect and publish the fragments preserved in other authors. These early editions were incomplete and often inaccurate, but they sparked interest. Poets began to imitate her, to imagine her, to fill in the gaps of her lost work. The Romantic period brought renewed attention to Sappho. Poets like Byron and Shelley admired her passion and intensity. Translators struggled to capture her voice in English. The fragments were translated and retranslated, each version reflecting the concerns of its own time. The 19th century also brought the first major papyrus discoveries. In the 1870s and 1880s, archaeologists working in Egypt found scraps of papyrus containing lines of Sappho that had not been seen for 1,000 years. These discoveries doubled the amount of her surviving work and revolutionized the study of her poetry. The 20th century brought more discoveries. In 2004, a nearly complete poem was identified on a papyrus in the University of Cologne's collection. This poem, known as the Tithonus poem or Fragment 58, describes old age and the inevitability of death. It is one of the most poignant of Sappho's surviving works, and its discovery caused international excitement. Each new discovery reminds us how much has been lost. Sappho wrote 9 books of poetry, hundreds of poems, thousands of lines. What survives is perhaps 5% of her total output. The rest is gone, burned or rotted or simply thrown away. Yet even 5% is enough to establish her greatness. The fragments that survive are of such quality that we can only imagine what the complete poems were like. They are like shards of a broken vase, beautiful in themselves but hinting at a beauty we can never fully see. The debate over Sappho's life and work continues. Scholars argue about the meaning of her poems, the nature of her relationships, the context in which she wrote. Was she a teacher? A priestess? A courtesan? A wife and mother? The evidence supports multiple interpretations, and certainty is impossible. What is certain is that Sappho wrote poetry of extraordinary power and beauty. Her voice, even in fragments, speaks across centuries. She captures the intensity of human emotion, love, desire, jealousy, loss, with a precision that later poets have envied and imitated. She writes about women with an intimacy and respect that is rare in any age. The survival of her work, fragmentary though it is, seems almost miraculous. Through centuries of neglect and destruction, through the burning of libraries and the decay of papyrus, enough has survived to let us hear her voice. She speaks to us from a world very different from our own, yet her words feel immediate and true. That is the mark of great poetry. It transcends its time and place, speaking to something universal in human experience. Sappho's poems are about love, and love is as powerful today as it was 2,600 years ago. Her words still move us, still make us feel, still remind us what it means to be human. In the end, perhaps that is why we remember Sappho. Not because of her biography, not because of the controversies that surrounded her, not because of her influence on later literature, but because her poetry speaks to the heart. It makes us feel less alone. It gives voice to emotions we cannot always express. It connects us to the past and to each other. The 10th Muse, they called her. A goddess among poets. And though most of her work is lost, enough remains to prove that the title was deserved. She was one of the greatest poets who ever lived, and her voice will never be silenced. The survival of Sappho's poetry is a story of chance and loss, of destruction and recovery. It begins in the Great Library of Alexandria, where scholars collected and edited her work in the 3rd century BCE. They divided her poems into 9 books, probably arranged by meter. They wrote commentaries and biographies. They ensured that her work would be preserved for future generations. For centuries, it was. Copies of Sappho's poems circulated throughout the Greek and Roman worlds. She was read in Egypt and Syria, in Rome and Gaul. Her work was quoted by grammarians, imitated by poets, studied by scholars. She was, by any measure, one of the most successful and influential poets of antiquity. Then came the decline. The reasons are complex: the rise of Christianity, with its suspicion of pagan literature. The economic collapse of the Roman Empire, which made papyrus scarce and copying expensive. The shift in literary tastes, which favored different styles and subjects. By the 6th century CE, Sappho was no longer widely read. Her poems were no longer being copied. They survived only in quotations and in the occasional papyrus copy that happened to be preserved. The papyrus copies, which might have saved her work, were themselves vulnerable. Papyrus rots when damp, burns when dry, and crumbles when handled. The climate of Egypt, where most papyri have been found, preserved some copies, but only those that were discarded in rubbish heaps and covered by sand. Thousands of papyrus rolls have been found in Egypt, but they represent a tiny fraction of what once existed. Most of Sappho's work is among the millions of books that have perished. The quotations preserved by other authors provide a different kind of survival. Ancient grammarians, rhetoricians, and scholars quoted Sappho to illustrate points of grammar, style, or content. These quotations range from single words to entire stanzas. They preserve lines that would otherwise be completely lost. But they are fragmentary and often taken out of context, leaving us with tantalizing glimpses of poems we cannot fully see. The discovery of new papyri in the 19th and 20th centuries has transformed our knowledge of Sappho. The first major find came in the 1870s, when archaeologists working at Oxyrhynchus in Egypt uncovered thousands of papyrus fragments, including several containing lines of Sappho. These fragments, though often tiny, added significantly to the corpus of her work. The most dramatic discovery came in 2004, when a German papyrologist identified a previously unknown poem by Sappho on a papyrus in the University of Cologne's collection. This poem, known as the Tithonus poem or Fragment 58, describes old age and the inevitability of death. It is one of the most complete and moving of Sappho's surviving works, and its discovery made headlines around the world. The poem begins, "You for the fragrant bosomed Muse's lovely gifts. Be zealous, girls, and the clear-songed lyre. But my once tender body old age now has seized, my hair's turned white instead of dark. My heart's grown heavy, my knees will not support me. That once were fleet for dancing as fawns. This state I often groan about, but what's to do? Not to be able to grow old, being human. That's impossible. For people used to say. That dawn with rosy arms, in love with Tithonus, carried him off to the world's end, young and handsome. But still in time gray age overtook him, though he had an immortal wife." The poem is poignant in its acceptance of aging and loss. Sappho acknowledges that her body has changed, that she can no longer dance as she once did. She groans about this state, but she also accepts that it is inevitable. Even Tithonus, beloved by the dawn goddess, could not escape old age. There is no bitterness here, only a kind of gentle resignation. This poem, like all of Sappho's work, is intensely personal and yet universal. It speaks to the experience of growing old, of losing the vitality of youth, of coming to terms with mortality. It is a theme that resonates across centuries, that touches everyone who reads it. Other papyrus discoveries have added smaller fragments, a few lines here, a stanza there. Each new fragment is eagerly studied by scholars, who hope to add to our understanding of Sappho's work. Each fragment also reminds us how much has been lost, how many poems we will never read. The fragments we have are like pieces of a shattered mosaic. We can see the beauty of individual pieces, but we cannot reconstruct the whole picture. We have to imagine what we cannot see, to infer from what survives what has been lost. Yet even in fragments, Sappho's poetry has power. The lines that survive are so vivid, so emotionally intense, that they create their own completeness. We do not need to know what came before or after to be moved by what we have. The fragments stand on their own as poetry, as art, as expressions of human feeling. This is perhaps the most remarkable thing about Sappho. Her work survives not despite its fragmentation but in some sense because of it. The fragments have a power that complete poems might lack. They are mysterious, evocative, open to interpretation. They invite us to participate in their completion, to imagine what is missing, to make them our own. The interpretation of Sappho's poetry has been shaped by the debates over her life and work. For centuries, scholars have argued about the meaning of her poems, the nature of her relationships, the context in which she wrote. These debates reflect not only the difficulty of interpreting fragmentary evidence but also the cultural assumptions of each age. In the 19th century, many scholars tried to explain away Sappho's love for women. They argued that she was a teacher, and her poems expressed pedagogical affection rather than erotic desire. They pointed to the existence of a sapphic circle of young women who studied with her, and they interpreted her love poems as expressions of teacherly devotion. This interpretation had little evidence to support it. The ancient sources do not describe Sappho as a teacher. Her poems do not read like pedagogical exercises. But the interpretation persisted because it made Sappho safe, acceptable, non-threatening. It allowed Victorian readers to admire her poetry without confronting its queerness. Other scholars took a different approach. They embraced Sappho's queerness, seeing her as a precursor and an ancestor. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as the modern gay rights movement began to emerge, Sappho became an icon for those who loved their own sex. Her name and her island gave us the words lesbian and sapphic, which became terms of identity and pride. The feminist movement of the 20th century found in Sappho a kindred spirit. Here was a woman poet from antiquity, writing about women's experiences, celebrating women's beauty, giving voice to women's desires. Feminist scholars recovered Sappho from the male-dominated tradition of classical scholarship, reading her work with fresh eyes and new questions. Today, Sappho is studied from many perspectives. Literary critics analyze her poetic technique. Historians try to understand her social context. Queer theorists explore the significance of her sexuality. Feminist scholars examine her representation of women. Each approach yields insights, and each reminds us how rich and complex her work is. The debates will continue, because the evidence is insufficient for certainty. We will never know exactly who Sappho was or what she intended. We will never know the full context of her poems or the exact nature of her relationships. But we do not need certainty to appreciate her work. The poems speak for themselves. Sappho's influence extends far beyond classical scholarship. Poets have been inspired by her for 2,000 years. Catullus adapted her most famous poem into Latin, creating one of the masterpieces of Roman literature. Swinburne wrote poems in her honor, celebrating her as a burning Sappho. Contemporary poets continue to translate and respond to her work. The sapphic stanza, the meter she perfected, has been used by poets in many languages. It consists of 3 long lines followed by a shorter one, with a specific pattern of long and short syllables. In English, poets have adapted it to the rhythms of their own language, creating versions that echo Sappho's original without exactly reproducing it. Her themes, love, desire, loss, memory, have become central to the Western poetic tradition. Every love poem written since Sappho owes something to her, whether directly or indirectly. She established the conventions of erotic poetry, the language of desire, the expression of passion. Poets have been building on her foundation for millennia. Her influence is not limited to poetry. Novelists have written books about her, imagining her life and times. Playwrights have dramatized her story. Composers have set her words to music. Artists have painted her portrait, though no authentic image survives. She has become a figure of the imagination, a symbol of poetry itself. In popular culture, Sappho appears in unexpected places. Her name is used for products and businesses. Her image appears on postage stamps and coins. She is referenced in songs and films. She has become, in some sense, a brand, a shorthand for lesbian identity and for women's poetry. This popular appropriation can be frustrating to scholars, who see the historical Sappho disappearing behind the legend. But it also testifies to her enduring appeal. People who have never read a line of her poetry know her name. She has entered the cultural bloodstream, become part of our shared vocabulary. That is a kind of immortality. The woman who lived on Lesbos 2,600 years ago, who wrote poems that were read and loved throughout the ancient world, who was nearly lost forever, that woman is still with us. Her name is spoken, her poems read, her memory honored. She has achieved what all poets hope for, survival beyond death. The fragments of Sappho's poetry are preserved in museums and libraries around the world. The papyri from Oxyrhynchus are in Oxford. The Cologne papyrus is in Germany. The quotations in ancient authors are scattered through hundreds of manuscripts. Each fragment is a physical object, with its own history of survival. The oldest fragments date from the 3rd century BCE, within a few generations of Sappho's own time. They were copied in Egypt, where Greek culture flourished after Alexander's conquest. They are written on papyrus in Greek. Uncial script, the handwriting of the Hellenistic world. They are torn and damaged, but the letters are still visible. Later fragments come from medieval manuscripts, where Sappho's lines are quoted in the margins or embedded in the text. These manuscripts were copied by monks who may not have known who Sappho was, who preserved her words without understanding their significance. The survival of these quotations is accidental, a byproduct of the preservation of other texts. The newest fragments come from the rubbish heaps of Oxyrhynchus, excavated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. These papyri were thrown away by their owners, used as wrapping paper or fuel, and preserved only by the dry Egyptian sand. They are the garbage of an ancient city, and they contain some of the most precious poetry in the world. Each fragment is a reminder of loss. The poems that survive are only a fraction of what Sappho wrote. The 9 books of Alexandrian edition are mostly gone. The commentaries and biographies are lost. The music that accompanied her words is silent. We have echoes where we might have had voices. But echoes can be beautiful. The fragments of Sappho are like the sound of a lyre heard from far away, faint but clear. They are enough to tell us what we are missing, and enough to make us grateful for what we have. The last word on Sappho will never be written. New fragments may be discovered, the sands of Egypt still hold many secrets. New interpretations will be proposed, new debates will arise, new readers will discover her work. She will continue to be translated, adapted, appropriated, and celebrated. Her poetry will continue to move people, as it has for 2,500 years. The woman who wrote about love and desire, who captured the trembling of the heart and the fire under the skin, who spoke for women and for all who love, that woman is not dead. She lives in every translation, every adaptation, every reader who feels her words. The 10th Muse, they called her. A goddess among poets. And like the gods, she is immortal, not in body, but in spirit, in the power of her words to reach across centuries and touch human hearts. That is the true miracle of Sappho. Not that her work survived, though that is remarkable enough. But that it still speaks to us, still moves us, still makes us feel. 2,500 years after she lived, her voice is not silenced. It echoes through time, and will continue to echo as long as there are readers to hear it. Sappho of Lesbos. The 10th Muse. The poet of love. Her fragments are our fragments, her losses are losses, her loves are loves. She is gone, but she is not dead. She is with us still.